Today's topic is going to be the Truman Doctrine. We will put the Truman Doctrine in its larger historical context, but certainly the Truman Doctrine is the most important doctrine throughout United States history. It really changes the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy, not only throughout the entirety of the Cold War, but even all the way up into the present. Although currently I think there's a little bit of a reframing of what U.S. foreign policy will be in the generations to come. But what is this Cold War that we speak of? Well, the Cold War, in which the Truman Doctrine was born, was an ideological contest between the two superpowers coming out of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, the Soviet Union was totalitarian in terms of its political structure, in terms of the way the government operated, and it was communistic in terms of the economic model that it had adopted. Whereas the United States has a political system with many democratic features and attaches itself to the capitalistic model. Now, both the Soviet Union and the United States, adhering to communism and capitalism respectively, are trying to exert their influence throughout the entire planet. And really this is so because communism and capitalism are expansionistic in and of themselves. For communism, we have an ideology that calls for a sea change in the way that human beings interact with one another, and really is geared towards trying to do away with extreme differentiations in wealth. This is supposed to be a revolution that impacts the entire human species, and thus shouldn't be confined merely to national boundaries. Whereas capitalism is the use of private property for profit, and of course those profits can be expanded the larger market that you are exposed to. And so the idea is constantly looking for new markets to unload your goods in. And so, of course, capitalism is going to desire other countries to participate in the same economic functions. So we really have this high-stakes contest between the United States and the Soviet Union, between communism and capitalism. Now, when does this Cold War begin? Well, it's kind of interesting question to ponder, considering that during World War II, these two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, are actually allies. As you've read in the textbook, you know that the Soviet Union and the United States and England are the dominant allies fighting against Nazi Germany, militaristic Japan, and fascist Italy. And it's really a strange alliance because England and the United States are both democratic and unabashedly capitalistic, whereas the Soviet Union is totalitarian and communistic. The ideologies and the political persuasions of England and the United States differ very much from that of the Soviet Union. But it's one of those examples of the old adage, an enemy of my enemy is a friend of mine, and both the Soviet Union and the United States and England were very much concerned about Adolf Hitler in particular, gobbling up more territory and obtaining global supremacy for the nation of Germany. So we have this strange alliance. It was always wrought with distrust. The three leaders of the dominant Allied powers, Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, were able to get along for the sake of the war effort, but there were always internal conflicts, and it didn't take a political genius to understand that the alliance only held because of the crisis at hand. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, is going to die during the final year of the Second World War, and we're going to get a new president in Harry Truman. And Truman is really a very different personality than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it's really going to arguably be the beginnings of the Cold War here. I think one could make the argument that the death of Roosevelt and the ascendancy of President Truman really change the relationship between the United States, England, and the Soviet Union. And the reason why I say this is because Truman was not prone to compromise. He was much more distrustful of Stalin than Roosevelt had been. And we're going to see really the jockeying for post-war position occur before World War II even comes to a conclusion, in large part as a result of Truman being elevated to the highest office in the United States. If you look at slide number 2 here, you'll see the big three as they were known. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, on the far left, new President Truman in the middle, and Joseph Stalin, the totalitarian ruler of the Soviet Union, on the far right. And it's here at the Potsdam Conference where we start to see the personality atmosphere begin to change now that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is no longer with us. If you go to slide number 3, you'll see that I have 3 bullet points in regards to this Potsdam Conference. And keep in mind, this Potsdam Conference is taking place while World War II is still underway. What can we say about it? Well, one is that Truman is one tough cookie, much like Winston Churchill, much like Joseph Stalin. Truman has no bones about saying what he really wants, and even at times behaving quite aggressively. Whereas before Truman, when we had Franklin Roosevelt, we had kind of a mediator, somebody who was willing to compromise to get Churchill and Stalin to achieve some semblance of common ground. But now that Roosevelt is gone, it is going to be really a facade, this notion of an alliance. But there's one extra nice little ingredient that might help us understand why Truman becomes increasingly aggressive as the Potsdam Conference goes on, and that's the word that Truman gets that the United States has successfully tested an atomic bomb, now has this super weapon, and Truman is not going to share this information with his quote-unquote ally Joseph Stalin, but Stalin, through his intelligence network, knows that the atomic bomb has successfully been tested, and we see this really kind of weird relationship between Truman and Stalin become even more hostile. And so it's possible that you could make the argument that it's the ascendancy of Truman as manifested through the Potsdam Conference that the Cold War really begins, and the alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States begins to crumble. But at least on the surface, the Cold War is yet to begin, and there is going to be some deals hashed out. Most importantly, what the fate of Germany will be once World War II comes to a conclusion completely. And it's determined that Germany is going to be divided and occupied by 4 powers. And if we go to slide number 4, we'll see that the eastern part of Germany is going to be under the jurisdiction of the Soviet Union, whereas the western portion of Germany will be divided into 3 different sectors, one controlled by England, one by France, and one by the United States. And so it's a joint occupation with 4 different nations having purview over particular zones. Now, if you look at the Soviet portion of Germany there in red, you'll also see this white island kind of smack dab in the middle, labeled Berlin. This is a very important industrial city for Germany, and it's actually determined that that city will be partitioned as well. And if you go to slide 5, you'll see that East Berlin will be under the jurisdiction of the Soviet Union, whereas West Berlin will be jointly occupied by France, Britain, and the United States. Now, this is an auspicious arrangement because Berlin, of course, is smack dab in the middle of the Soviet sphere, and this could potentially be a flashpoint for conflict. And you might be scratching your heads asking the question, why would the Soviet Union, the United States, and England agree to such arrangement that could lead to so much havoc? And the answer to that is because, well, at least on the surface, when this agreement is brokered, There is an alliance that's in place. The Cold War is not obvious yet, although the writing is on the wall that coming out of World War II there probably will be some pretty significant differences between the two superpowers in the Soviet Union and the United States. Well, anyways, World War II does come to a conclusion. The atomic bomb is used on Japan. They surrender. Hitler had committed suicide, and Germany had capitulated, and long before that, Italy had surrendered as well. And so now the big question is, well, what is the post-war World War II world going to look like? Say that 10 times fast. Post-World War II world going to look like? Well, there are some politicians on the international stage that are casting warnings. And one of those individuals is Winston Churchill, a member of the Big Three, that former Prime Minister of England. Well, Winston Churchill had been voted out of office, but he was still a relevant figure. And he actually traveled out to the United States, and he went on a speaking tour, traveled around with President Truman. He actually went to Truman's home state of Missouri and delivered a speech known as the Iron Curtain speech. And as you can see on slide 6 there, it states that the Iron Curtain was a term used by Winston Churchill to describe the separating of the communist lands of Eastern Europe from the West. What Churchill is arguing here is that the Soviet Union is on the march. It's gobbling up more and more territory, more and more nations, and forcing upon those nations totalitarian regimes and a communistic economic model that cut at sharp angles against notions of liberty and freedom. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the words used by Winston Churchill in this speech, and this might help us understand the context in which the Truman Doctrine is born. Take a look at slide number 7 here. This is a direct quote from Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. It reads, "In front of the Iron Curtain which lies across Europe are other causes for anxiety. In a great number of countries, far from the Russian frontiers and throughout the world, communist fifth columns are established and work in complete unity and absolute obedience to the directions they receive from the communist center." Now, this was an important quote to highlight here because it is part and parcel to an overarching myth that communism only developed throughout the world because of the designs of the Soviet Union itself, and that proves to be erroneous. We find that several countries are going to adopt communism not because the Soviet Union forces it upon them, but because they see it as the best way to address their own nationalistic issues, such as was the case in China, such as the case in Vietnam, such as the case in a place like Yugoslavia. But nevertheless, what we have is this notion that the Soviet Union is leading the communist charge. And in one way that is true, but I think you can take it too far. The idea is that if you destroy the Soviet Union, you destroy communism. Without the Soviet Union, there is no communism. And that proves to be actually a little bit less than accurate. Now, more to the point here, in terms of the establishment of the Truman Doctrine, is this particular quote from the Iron Curtain speech. "The Soviet Union," Winston Churchill argues, "desires expansion of their power and doctrines. Our difficulties and dangers will not be relieved by a policy of appeasement. There is nothing they admire so much as strength, and there is nothing for which they have less respect than for military weakness." So really what Churchill's arguing here is that the Soviet Union needs to be met with military strength. That is the only way to prevent the Soviet Union from continually marching forward, gobbling up more terrain, and expanding the governmental system of totalitarianism and expanding the economic model of communism. Now, Churchill argues that throughout history, England had been the great defender of liberty and freedom throughout the world, and had exerted a great deal of influence throughout the world. But coming out of World War II, Churchill argues, England had been struck a major blow through war and had become economically vulnerable and could not take up this all-important historical task of going toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union and making sure that communism did not spread any further. But Churchill says the United States, on the other hand, is coming out of World War II more affluent and prosperous than ever. Its industrial capacity had been proven to be great in the throes of World War II. And really what Churchill's major point here with the Iron Curtain speech is to convince the American people and President Truman to take on the responsibility of world's policemen, to arrest the expansion of communism wherever it might threaten, to keep the Soviet Union in check, to become vigilant about the affairs of the world, to be concerned about the threat of communism and the destruction of liberty in all four corners of the globe. And so Truman, with the Iron Curtain speech, in short, is trying to persuade the United States to become a world's policeman state that is dedicated to spending all the resources necessary to have a viable military to undertake this task, this great task of defeating communism throughout the world. Now, this is a pressing issue because communism is threatening to expand throughout the world in real time. It's happening very fast. If we go to slide, let's see, what slide is this? If we go to slide number 9, you'll see the words "lines drawn and Cold War is underway." Well, where is communism likely going to expand first? Well, the policy experts believe that it's going to be Greece or Turkey where the big threat is immediate. And this is a natural place for communism to actually spread, considering the geography of Greece and Turkey. If we go to slide number 10 here, we'll see that there are already numerous countries that are behind Churchill's Iron Curtain. All of these green countries, including East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, so forth and so on, are really very much under the thumb of the Soviet Union, have totalitarian puppet regimes that are taking their orders from Moscow and the Soviet Union, from Stalin directly. The communist country of Yugoslavia, however, is on the outside of the Iron Curtain, communism without influence from the Soviet Union. But the fear here is that the Iron Curtain is going to be recast to encircle Greece and Turkey. And the reason why this is the fear is because there are two civil wars that broke out in Turkey and Greece. And this is a pattern that develops throughout much of the world in the wake of World War II. Remember that Nazi Germany had been expansionistic. They had moved into numerous countries, toppled the governments of those countries, and took over. Italy had done the same thing throughout numerous countries as well. Japan had done the same thing. And so now that Japan, Italy, and Germany have been defeated, there is going to be some contestation over who would lead the country. And the leaders will ultimately determine whether those countries are communistic or capitalistic. Now, in Greece and Turkey, we have two factions in Greece, two factions in Turkey. A capitalist faction in Greece, a communist faction in Greece, engaging in civil war, and the winner of that civil war will, of course, determine what the economic model is going to be. If the capitalists win, capitalism will be the economic model of Greece. If the communists win, communism will be the economic model. And the same thing in Turkey, two factions fighting a civil war. So the issue is, should the United States take on the role of Big Brother and help the capitalists in Greece and Turkey win the day and stop communism from spreading into that particular area? Now, of course, Winston Churchill, he's clamoring for the United States to step up. But Truman, as Commander-in-Chief, has to make the ultimate decision. Will the United States become the world's policeman and protect the world, including Greece and Turkey here first and foremost, from the villainous communists? But Truman does not want to make a foreign policy decision based on what a former Prime Minister of England has to say. He needs his own intelligence. He needs his own advice from his own advisors. And Truman is actually going to turn to a seasoned veteran, a guy by the name of George Kennan, here on slide number 11. George Kennan was a U.S. diplomat to the Soviet Union. He had lived in the Soviet Union for, I believe, right around a decade, and he felt like he understood Soviet politics and Soviet culture and the Soviet mindset. And he put all of this together in a report that he sent to Truman, known as the Long Telegram. And George Kennan argued that the Soviet Union was expansionistic, that the Soviet Union was trying to gobble up more territory. But for George Kennan, it wasn't simply the desire on the part of the Soviet Union to expand communism around the world. It was more of a national security issue for the Soviet Union. There was a cultural paranoia that really had permeated all elements of Soviet society that was rooted in history. The Soviet Union had been invaded numerous times, even in recent history, invaded during the Napoleonic era, invaded during World War I, and most recently World War II. And World War II was so devastating to the Soviet Union. We're looking at 20 million Soviet citizens losing their lives during the World War II. That's about 1 out of every 16 members of that population actually died. I mean, the Soviet Union spilt much more blood than any other nation. And so George Kennan argued that, yes, the Soviet Union is on the march. They're trying to gobble up more area and exert influence over those areas because there's an anticipation that the Soviet Union, as history has proven, will be invaded again, and the Soviet Union needs to have a buffer, a geographical buffer, so that when they're invaded, the fighting will take place on the periphery rather than in the motherland of Russia, in the streets of Moscow or in the streets of Stalingrad. And this will minimize the death toll that the Soviet Union will experience when that hostile outside world comes along once again. So George Kennan agrees with Winston Churchill that the Soviet Union is on the march. They're trying to gain more influence, a broader geographical buffer, but for different motivating reasons. Winston Churchill sees the Soviet Union as creating some sort of evil plan to force communism down the throats of every human being throughout the world, and will not rest until it's able to accomplish this task, whereas George Kennan argues that the Soviet Union is expansionistic principally for national security purposes to insulate itself from a proven hostile outside world. But both of their recommendations, both Churchill and Kennan, are calling upon Truman to do something about Soviet expansion. And so Truman ultimately decides it's time to act, and he issues the Truman Doctrine. Now, if you go to slide 12 here, you'll see I have a picture of President Truman. What is the Truman Doctrine specifically? Well, the Truman Doctrine is a clear foreign policy statement coming from President Truman. It asserts that the United States is going to contain communism to where it already exists. That's the hallmark of the Truman Doctrine. Truman recognizes that the Soviet Union has already expanded its influence into Eastern Europe. He doesn't like it, but he accepts it in many ways. But that's it. For Truman, he's going to contain communism to where it already exists. The United States will be willing to use force to prevent that communism from gaining even one more inch of soil. The United States will become the world's policeman, protect the rest of the world from the communist menace. If communism threatens in Latin America, the United States will be there. If communism threatens throughout Africa or the Middle East or Asia or Europe or anywhere, the United States will be there and will commit all of the resources necessary to enforce this Truman Doctrine. So the idea is to prevent communism from spreading any further. A full commitment on the part of the United States to do this. And this is a very important move because before December 7th, 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the United States had been in large part isolationist. The United States believed that it had been almost divinely positioned on the face of the planet. The old mantra, thank God for the Atlantic, thank God for the Pacific, this God-given moat to protect the United States from a hostile outside world, should be taken advantage of. The United States should be more concerned about its domestic issues than about all of these wars that seem to plague the other continents of the planet. But since the United States had been attacked in late 1941, of course the United States was going to respond and declare war on Japan, and ultimately Germany and Italy will declare war on the United States, and the United States will be brought into the Second World War. Now, certainly coming out of World War II, the United States could have chosen to go back to an isolationist role, in which the United States wouldn't have to have a huge, viable, strong military to exert influence, or the United States could have a huge army, have a huge navy, grow its Air Force, grow its Marine Corps, and be ready to deploy these troops anywhere around the world if there was deemed to be some sort of communist threat. The costs are enormous. The vigilance is going to be enormous. It's going to be an all-in approach. And I think because the United States has adhered to the Truman Doctrine for so long, we almost take it for granted, as if the United States has always been the world's police. But it's really only been for about a quarter of our nation's history that the United States has taken on such a pronounced role in international affairs. But that's the idea. The Truman Doctrine is really the doctrine of the Cold War. The United States is all in, willing to expend whatever it takes in terms of money or blood to make sure that the Soviet Union and communism are doomed to defeat. So I'll leave you with that. And what we'll do when we come back to our lecture titled Truman Doctrine Part 2 is talk about some of the other aspects of the Truman Doctrine, where it's implemented, how successful Truman was in implementing it at varying places throughout the world. One thing that I can say is the first test of the Truman Doctrine in Greece and Turkey proved to bear fruit. Both Turkey and Greece are going to remain in the capitalist fold. The capitalistic factions in Greece and Turkey defeat their communist counterparts, and the Iron Curtain does not extend around those two countries. But what about some other places? We're going to see a big test of the Truman Doctrine in Berlin. We'll see a test of the Truman Doctrine in Korea, a test of the Truman Doctrine in China, and we'll use those as our examples to determine whether Truman was successful at implementing and defending his all-important Truman Doctrine.